On June 6, 1944, at 1:53 in the morning, the sky over Normandy was already breaking apart. Low clouds tore at the moonlight. Tracer fire stitched red lines through the darkness, and transport aircraft roared east to west in loose, trembling formations. Inside one of them, a U.S. Army paratrooper stood clipped to a static line, boots planted on a vibrating metal floor, counting breaths instead of seconds. He was 23 years old. His name mattered less than what he was about to become. In that moment, he was simply a human body suspended between fear and duty. The aircraft lurched as flak burst below. The green jump light had not come on yet. Sweat ran down his spine despite the cold. His rifle knocked gently against his knee. Somewhere beneath the clouds were hedgerows, flooded fields, stone villages, and people asleep who did not know the night was about to enter their homes. He had trained for this moment for months, repeating procedures until they erased thought. But training did not prepare him for the sound metal tearing air, engines straining, men vomiting quietly into the corners of their helmets. When the green light finally flashed, the jump master shouted, and the line moved forward, one step, no looking back. The door opened, and the night rushed in, violent and loud. Then he was falling. Wind slammed into his chest. The aircraft vanished above him. Below, the earth was invisible, hidden by darkness and smoke. He pulled his knees in, waiting for the shock. The parachute opened hard. Silence followed, broken only by distant gunfire and the hiss of fabric. He was drifting, not toward the drop zone, not toward the markers he had memorized on maps. He drifted sideways, carried by wind he could not fight. As his eyes adjusted, he saw a shape rising beneath him, a stone building, tall, enclosed, unfamiliar. He descended too fast to steer away. The building had a courtyard. The walls were high. There was no place to land cleanly. His boots struck stone. He collapsed forward, tangled in parachute lines. Breath knocked from his chest. For a moment, there was no gunfire. No shouting. Only the echo of his fall and the smell of old stone and damp earth. Then doors opened. Footsteps approached. Voices whispered not German, not English. womensvoices.com/measured. Shocked, but not screaming. As he reached for his knife to cut the lines, lantern lights spilled across the courtyard. He looked up from the ground and realized where he had landed. It was a convent. The paratrooper did not know the name of the convent. He did not know the names of the women standing several steps away, holding lanterns close to their chests. He knew only what he could see. Plain habits, pale faces, hands trembling, but steady enough to keep the lights from dropping. He knew enough history to understand that religious houses were not military targets, and enough instinct to understand that his presence had just dragged war across their threshold. He was part of the Airborne, assault meant to open the way for the landings on the beaches. His unit had been scattered by cloud cover and heavy anti-aircraft fire. Some men had landed miles from their objectives. Some had drowned in flooded fields. Some were already dead. He did not know this yet. All he knew was that his rifle was loaded, his leg burned from the impact, and he was standing in the middle of a place where silence had once been a rule. Before the jump, he had been an ordinary soldier. He had grown up far from Normandy, in a town where the nights were quiet and the buildings newer than this convent's stones. He had enlisted young, believing the war would be decided quickly. By the time he stood under the lantern light, he had learned that wars did not end quickly, and that survival often depended on chance more than courage. The nuns did not shout. They did not run. One of them stepped forward, older than the rest, her face lined by years of discipline rather than fear. She looked at the parachute pulled at his feet, then at the insignia on his uniform. There was a pause, heavy and deliberate. In that pause, he understood that his life was now partly in their hands. German troops were stationed throughout the region. Patrols moved along roads and through villages, responding to reports of airborne landings. A single noise, a single mistake could bring them into the courtyard within minutes. The paratrooper knew this. The nuns knew it too. None of them needed to say it aloud. The older nun gestured toward the open doorway. It was not an order, it was an invitation weighed against danger. He hesitated only long enough to cut himself free of the parachute lines. The fabric was quickly gathered and pulled inside. The lanterns were lowered, doors closed. Stone swallowed sound. Inside, the convent smelled of wax and age. The walls were thick, the corridors were narrow. He was led through them without haste, as if haste itself might draw attention. No, one spooky. His boots left faint marks on the floor that another nun wiped away almost immediately. He realized then that they had done this kind of quiet work before, not for soldiers, perhaps, but for survival, in a small room. He was told to sit. Water was pressed into his hands. A cloth was given for his bleeding leg. The older nun met his eyes briefly. There was no smile. There was resolve. Outside, the distant sound of gunfire rolled across the countryside. Inside, the convent held its breath. This was not heroism as he had imagined it. There were no cheers, no commands, no certainty. There was only a shared understanding between strangers that what happened next would test them all, and that neutrality did not protect the innocent when armies moved through the night. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time inside the convent lost its shape. The paratrooper sat on a narrow bench, helmet resting on his knees, listening to sounds he could not place. Somewhere beyond the walls, engines growled. Boots struck stone streets. Voices called out in German, sharp and impatient. Each sound carried through the building like a question that could not be answered. The nuns moved with practiced restraint. One stood watch near a small window, peering through a crack in the shutters. Another knelt in PR * by the afternoon of June 6, 1944. The plan no longer existed, not in the way it had on maps or briefing boards. The airborne landings had scattered men across miles of unfamiliar terrain. Radios were lost. Officers were missing. Units that were meant to move as one were now fragments, stitched together by chance encounters in hedgerows and fields. The paratrooper who had survived the convent understood this quickly when he finally found others like himself, exhausted, unsure, but alive. They gathered in ones and twos. A whispered password, a glance at insignia. Relief followed immediately by the weight of reality. They were far from their assigned objectives. German positions still held key roads and bridges. The beaches behind them were filling with men who depended on airborne troops to disrupt defenses, delay counterattacks, and create confusion. Every minute mattered, yet they were too few, too scattered, and too poorly equipped to do what they had been trained to do. This was where the impossible idea began to form. It did not come from a single voice or rank. It emerged slowly through shared glances and unfinished sentences. If they could not act as a unit, they would act as a presence. If they could not seize objectives, they would create the illusion that they already had. Noise could substitute for numbers. Movement could replace coordination. Fear, carefully applied, could become a weapon. The paratrooper listened as the idea took shape. Small groups would move aggressively through the countryside, firing sporadically, attacking supply lines, cutting communication wires, ambushing patrols, then vanishing. The goal was not victory in the traditional sense. It was delay, confusion, pressure applied unevenly, unpredictably, enough to force the occupying forces to hesitate, to hold back reserves, to doubt their own intelligence. There were risks, layered upon risks. Every engagement increased the chance of capture or death. Ammunition was limited. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Civilians would be caught between armed men and suspicion. The paratrooper thought of the convent again, not as a refuge this time, but as a reminder of what failure could cost others. No one spoke of glory. There was no talk of heroism. The tone was practical, restrained. A sergeant, whether by rank or simply by presence, summed it up quietly. They would do what they could, for as long as they could, and accept that survival was uncertain. Heads? Nada. There were no cheers. Agreement did not need enthusiasm. That as they prepared to move, the paratrooper felt the weight of transformation settle fully. He had landed in Normandy as part of a massive operation designed by distant planners. He was now part of something improvised, fragile, and deeply human. Decisions would be made without orders. Mistakes would be paid for immediately. There would be no clear line between success and failure, only consequences. They moved out before dusk, using the last light to orient themselves. The countryside looked deceptively calm. Birds still moved through hedgerows. Smoke rose from villages without revealing its cause. War here was not constant noise, but a tension that snapped without warning. Each step forward carried the memory of the night before the convent, the lanterns, the silence that had saved his life. That silence now had to be broken, deliberately, strategically. The impossible idea demanded it, and as darkness returned to Normandy, the scattered paratroopers prepared to turn their weakness into uncertainty, their small numbers into shadows that would stretch far larger than reality allowed. The first shots were not part of a battle. They were punctuation, a sudden crack of rifle fire near a crossroads, followed by movement in the hedge. A German patrol halted, unsure whether it faced a handful of men or the edge of a larger force. By the time it reacted, the paratroopers were already gone, slipping through fields they had memorized only minutes earlier. This pattern repeated through the night: fire, movement, disappearance. Communication lines were cut where possible. A small explosives charge collapsed the narrow bridge, not to destroy it completely, but to block it long enough to force rerouting. Supply vehicles were fired upon from cover, then abandoned. Each action was small in isolation. Together, they created a landscape of uncertainty. The paratrooper moved with a group of 5. None of them had met before that day. Trust was built through action, not conversation. They spoke only when necessary, and even then in fragments. A Handsignale whispered warning, a shared pause before crossing open ground. Fear was constant, but it no longer dominated. It sharpened attention instead. At one point, they took cover as armored vehicles passed along a nearby road. The engines were loud, confident. The men inside believed they were moving toward a defined threat. They did not know how thin the line truly was. The paratrooper watched them pass and felt an unfamiliar emotion, not hatred, not triumph, but a sober recognition of proximity. Life and death separated by concealment and timing. As the hours wore on, exhaustion crept in. Muscles burned, eyes strained to separate shadow from movement. Mistakes became more likely. A snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. A distant shout sent pulses of adrenaline through already taxed bodies. Still, they pressed on. The beaches behind them were crowded with men pushing inland, step by step. Delay here meant lives there. Near dawn, they encountered resistance that did not dissolve immediately. A brief exchange of fire pinned them down longer than planned. Bullets struck earth and wood close enough to be felt. The paratrooper fired deliberately, conserving ammunition, aware that every shot narrowed future options. When they finally broke contact, it was without celebration. One man was wounded, another shaken into silence. They moved again, slower now, but intact. As light began to creep into the sky, the landscape revealed the cost of the night. Smoke hung low. Fields were torn by tracks and craters. Civilians watched from doorways, unreadable, measuring the danger of being seen. The paratrooper avoided their eyes, remembering the convent and the risk that hospitality had carried. He understood that even unspoken contact could draw suspicion. By mid-morning, word filtered through fragmented channels that larger forces were advancing inland. The confusion had worked, at least in part. Enemy movements were delayed. Orders contradicted each other. Time precious and irreversible had been bought. The paratroopers did not linger. They shifted again, blending into new formations as more men emerged from hiding. The impossible idea faded back into necessity, then into memory, replaced by more conventional fighting as lines began to form. For the paratrooper, the night's work felt strangely unreal, as if it had happened in a space between official history and lived experience. Yet its impact was undeniable. The chaos they had created could not be measured easily, but it had altered decisions made far beyond their view. It had forced hesitation where speed was expected, and it had demonstrated once more that wars are not shaped only by grand strategies, but by the accumulated choices of individuals acting under impossible pressure. As the day wore on, and Normandy burned under a rising sun, the paratrooper carried forward not pride, but clarity. He had seen how fragile plans became on contact with reality, and how adaptability born from necessity. Not ambition could still change the course of events, even if no one ever recorded the details. By the end of June 6, 1944, the shape of the invasion had changed, though no single man could see it clearly. Reports moved slowly. Decisions were made with incomplete information, yet across Normandy, delays and confusion had accumulated, minute by minute, action by action. The scattered airborne landings, initially judged chaotic, had forced occupying forces to respond to threats that seemed larger than they were. Chimiwaz, Loshi opportunities narrowed. The cost of hesitation became measurable. The paratrooper learned none of this immediately. He learned only what survival allowed. He learned which roads were no longer safe, which villagers were emptied by fear, which nights never truly became quiet again. He fought on, regrouped, advanced, and retreated when ordered. The war resumed its familiar rhythm of exhaustion, movement, and loss. The night of the convent faded into something he rarely spoke about. Historically, the airborne operations of D-Day remain debated, analyzed through maps and casualty figures. Some drops missed objectives entirely. Others achieved success through improvisation rather than design. What became clear, over time, was that disorder itself had become a factor. Small groups acting independently disrupted responses meant for larger formations. Confusion, delayed counterattacks, uncertainty shaped decisions made far from hedgerows and fields. The actions of civilians rarely appear in operational summaries. Their choices are harder to quantify, yet without them, many soldiers would not have survived the first hours. In Normandy, farmers, villagers, and religious communities were forced into decisions without neutrality as protection. To help was dangerous. To refuse was also dangerous. Silence carried its own risks. The convent where the paratrooper landed was not unique in its dilemma. Across occupied territory, civilians were pressed between armies that did not ask permission before arriving. History records, battles, and outcomes. But it often leaves unnamed those who acted without weapons, whose resistance or compassion altered individual fates rather than front lines. As the campaign moved inland and the war progressed toward its conclusion, the significance of those early hours became clearer in retrospect. D-Day did not succeed because every element went according to plan. It succeeded because adaptation replaced certainty when certainty collapsed. The airborne chaos did not break the operation. It reshaped it. For the paratrooper, historical meaning arrived only years later, filtered through memory rather than documents. He understood that survival had depended as much on restraint as on action, as much on silence as on force. That understanding remained with him, a private truth within a public victory, and a reminder that history often turns on moments never intended to matter. The paratrooper returned home after the war carrying fewer visible marks than many others. There were no parades for the night he spent hidden beneath a convent, no medals for silence maintained under threat. He resumed an ordinary life, shaped by experiences that resisted simple explanation. When asked about the war, he spoke carefully, choosing facts over emotion, details over declarations, yet some memories refused to fade. The lantern light in the courtyard, the calm voice that answered armed men at the door, the realization that his life had been preserved not by strategy, but by a moral choice made by strangers. These moments surfaced unexpectedly, years later, during quiet evenings or unremarkable mornings. He never learned what became of the convent. Whether it survived the fighting, whether those who lived there faced consequences afterward, history did not record their names alongside dates and objectives. Their absence from records did not diminish their role. It revealed the limits of what records can hold. As decades passed, D-Day became a symbol, then a lesson, then a reference point taught in classrooms. The complexity of that night was often reduced to arrows on maps and photographs of beaches. The airborne chaos was summarized, its human edges smoothed by distance. Yet within that simplification, countless individual decisions remained embedded, shaping outcomes invisibly. The paratrooper understood that war had not transformed him into a hero or a villain. It had made him a witness. He had seen how quickly order dissolved and how responsibility did not disappear with it. He had learned that courage was not exclusive to those who carried weapons, and that neutrality could not always be maintained when innocence was threatened. In later years, he sometimes spoke to younger generations. He did not offer slogans or certainty. He described fear honestly. He described dependence on people he had never met, on choices he could not control. When asked what he remembered most, he did not mention combat. He mentioned a place of quiet and people who chose to protect life without expecting recognition. The legacy of that night was not strategic brilliance or tactical perfection. It was a reminder that even within systems designed for destruction, human agency persists. Not loudly, not reliably, but enough to matter, enough to alter one life, then another, then outcomes no single person could foresee. That understanding remained his final inheritance from the war. Not pride, not resentment, but clarity. A knowledge carried forward that history is built not only by those who command events, but by those who respond to them, often unseen, when the cost of doing nothing is too high. Questions for the audience. What would you have done if protecting a stranger meant risking everything you had? Can acts of silence and restraint be as powerful as acts of force in times of war? How many untold lives shaped history without ever being recorded? This is the history of World War II. Whoever oppresses the innocent is an oppressor. Neither the earth belongs to this oppressor, nor does the sky belong to him. We stand now and forever with the oppressed. This is WWII Files. See you in the next one.